Good evening. My name is Dan Thompson. I'm Dean of Fine Arts of Studio and Caminati. I want to thank you all for being here both in person and virtually. To begin with, a couple of protocols on this evening's affairs. Please turn off all cell phones before we get started. And chat questions if you wish via YouTube. I'll monitor the chat box and I'll ask questions for you at the very end of the event. So please plan for that. If you're going to ask questions in the audience here, please wait for the mic so that the audience can follow along and follow the narrative of the conversation. Thank you. This will be our final Bennett Schmidt lecture on the higher aim of art for the year 2021. I want to begin by thanking Stephen Allen Bennett and Dr. Elaine Melody Schmidt for their generosity and vision in underwriting this entire series. Studio and Caminati's Bennett Schmidt lectures are, as many of you know, an opportunity to ask deeper questions about why we do what we do and how are we going to apply our skills to tell the great visual stories of our age. Tonight's speaker is an old friend of the school, one of our original teachers, maybe a future teacher, and one I can honestly say whose life was profoundly impacted by Studio and Caminati. Michael Grimaldi studied painting and drawing at the New York Studio School, the National Academy of Design, the Art Students League of New York, and performed independent studies in anatomy and dissection at the Facultad Medicina in Buenos Aires and the Drexel University College of Medicine. Grimaldi has taught drawing, painting, and anatomy for over 20 years at various institutions, including the School of Visual Arts, the National Academy, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the Art Students League of New York. He has also taught advanced artistic anatomy at Drexel University College of Medicine's Department of Anatomy and Neuroscience. Grimaldi has received numerous awards, including the Alma Shapiro Prize, an affiliated fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, the Edward G. McDowell Travel Grant, 2 Elizabeth Green Shields Foundation grants, and most recently, a residency in Nevada. He has exhibited at museums and galleries around the world, including the Mori Art Center in Tokyo, the Arnaud Museum in Elmira, the National Academy Museum, the Beijing World Art Museum, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts Museum, the Woodmere Museum, and Fontbonne University Gallery in St. Louis. Also, the De Young Museum, the Naples Museum, the John Pence Gallery, Forum Gallery, Herschel Nadler Modern, Mark Miller Gallery, and the Joshua Liner Gallery in Manhattan. Michael is here in person as well as virtually this evening to discuss his most recent series of works, the Decameron series. We're very happy to have him. Won't you join me in welcoming Michael Grimaldi?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me back here. The space looks beautiful, and congratulations. So, well, I'm Michael. It's nice to meet all of you. So this is kind of a strange thing. Bringing up, we could kind of do a survey of your work, everything that we've done so far, that kind of stuff. And I decided, like, with this presentation, to kind of go a little bit more into the working process, right? A little bit more into, like, some of the things why I kind of titled the lecture Departures is that, as artists, we're always redefining ourselves. We always have a responsibility to kind of not create a caricature of what we have become, if that makes any sense, to fall back on what we're comfortable with. As Goethe said, there are many dangers in life and safety is among them. So I wanted to kind of get into a little bit of, before we kind of go into the images and stuff like that, I started off as with an extreme interest in science, as you could probably figure out with the anatomy stuff, drawing all the time, but primarily started off as a painter, right? And probably about, oh my gosh, almost 20 years ago, started making a very conscious decision to start altering that towards drawing, monochromes, things like that, right? I'll try to get into why that happened, why that sort of evolved in a certain way. And I might as well just start kind of going into some of the images here. This is going back about maybe 14 years ago, something like that. It was a street scene in Naples. So large-scale work drawing on paper, graphite drawing. And a lot of the time, like, what happened with me, I think, was, our education, when you go through kind of traditional training and things like that, everything is revolving around the study of the figure, right? With kind of my interest in anatomy as well, that became like really a kind of heavy load to bear, right? And so when I was kind of like working more and more, I started realizing like, it was actually a little bit easier to start setting up a narrative structure, you know, with things that were not figure-based, if that makes any sense, right? And so I think for a long time, a lot of my work was really kind of focusing a lot more on, you know, genre scenes or interiors or exteriors, things like that. You know, a sketch from a Florentine doorway, well, the last time or the time before I was in Florence. You know, and one of the things that was a lot easier for me to kind of look at is the abstraction when you're seeing something that is non-figurative, right? Figure has a heavy psychological load attached to it, right? We always make an association with things like that. In a lot of ways, like growing up in New York City in the 1970s and 80s, you know, I was influenced a lot by the works of the abstract expressionist painters, right? Robert Motherwell and Franz Klein and all of these kind of amazing artists whose work are very different from what I do, right? Which has a kind of natural tendency to try to describe things. But found it a lot easier to start getting a little bit more into the abstract structure of images and to kind of, in some ways, kind of avoid the heaviness of the figure itself, right? And the kind of ramifications of that. Still life in my studio of objects. And so even objects that are more humanoid, they're, you know, the abstraction was a lot easier to start kind of getting into. And then as a result, sort of being able to kind of create a mood, right? Or create a tone that I could respond to as an artist that sort of operated on a certain degree of ambiguity, right? So that's going to be something that we're going to really talk about tonight, is the sort of relationship of clarity and ambiguity. You know, as a representational painter, you represent things, right? It's kind of representational, it's realistic, right? But in another way, there's a fundamental flaw in what I kind of see with the struggle of being a representational or figurative artist, in that description becomes finite, right? So this is an interior of my living room at the time. This, right before lockdown, started trying to get back into the figure, but then was faced again with a very similar dilemma, right? So suddenly, wow, there's a model, whether it's well executed or not, we have a person standing in a room, centralized, and suddenly, once again, I started finding that the narrative structure starts collapsing upon itself, right? So, and it's a tricky thing because, like, I was just talking with Dan a little bit before we started about the Ghent altarpiece, right? And the Adam and Eve figures in that are some of the most just sublime figures that you can imagine, but sort of creating a context where the figure is not necessarily, they're a supporting cast within that, if that makes sense, right? But it isn't the fetishization of the human form, right? And so that's always been something that I've found like a very peculiar dilemma. And as you can imagine, when you're teaching too, your subject is the model, right? When you're studying anatomy, your subject is the human form, right? You're getting into the study of the nuances of psychology, facial expression, of body language, like all of those kind of epic things that are kind of drive us as human beings. But then also finding like, ooh, that's a heavy load to bear when you start kind of working on paintings, drawings, whatever you're doing, if that makes sense. So another piece just before lockdown where kind of fractalizing the figure. So I've always found in a lot of my work that it was a lot easier to kind of show or kind of deal with the human condition a little bit more when you dehumanize it, right? When you start kind of getting a breakdown of things. And this is a little bit of a sort of inspired a little bit. This is the prop closet at the New York Academy of Art. But it was kind of inspired by a Stanley Kubrick film called The Killer's Kiss, one of his early black and white films. And the culmination of this amazing epic film noir is a chase scene that goes through a mannequin factory. But and then also immediately before lockdown, my 11-year-old daughter said, asked me a kind of pointed question saying, like, when you were a kid, when you were my age, what did you draw? What did you paint? I was like, oh, I did spaceships like Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars and stuff like that. And she asked, like, why don't you do that anymore? So I was like, that's a really good question. So ended up kind of doing a couple of sort of experimentations that sort of, in this way, kind of operated a lot more on the clarity because it's completely fantasy and devoid of a narrative, right, in a lot of ways, or sort of implies a narrative that could be a little bit more ambiguous. So in that, and another piece that's actually in progress here, so with that, you have like a lot of things kind of swimming through your mind, right, as a lot of us have experienced over the last, 2 years at this point. We're sort of under our own microscope, right, as artists, kind of looking at like what is the bigger meaning of all of the things that we're doing, right? What do we want out of the work? For a lot of us too, scale things changed. A lot of people lost studios, and ended up working. So there's the scale of their work, right, started reducing. And in some ways, it was a really great opportunity to really kind of figure out like what's important, right? And then also having a little bit of like a, existing within a Petri dish where you can sort of examine that big existential question of why am I doing this? Like, why am I waking up in the morning? Why do I find what I'm doing important? Which I think is a really critical thing for a visual artist to do, or an artist or a human being to do, right? So kind of going into a lot of the things that I was like kind of researching here and trying to kind of let fester in my mind, right, or kind of ferment and kind of go through things, was that idea of the power of ambiguity, right, within something. If you're spelling out some, let's say if you kind of let's say if you're constructing an image, right, and that image is too blatant, too clear, right? In some ways, like I feel like your response is very quick. You have a good, strong readability of the image, right, and then you kind of lead it. All of us have seen movies where it's sort of like we're along for the ride, right, and you leave the movie theater or you finish the novel, and you kind of feel like, okay, got it, and you're never going to think about it again, right? If we think about the great movies, right, if we think about the great works of literature, you can think about them for years afterwards, right? You can kind of revisit these things. You get a different reading of it when you're reading this book at the age of 14 or at the age of 25 or at the age of 35 or at the age of 50, right? And we find that with paintings a lot of the time too, right? I mean, going to the Met, you look at the one De Pareja by Velázquez, and I remember that when I was 19 years old, seeing that, I think for the first time, and having a very profound relationship with that piece, but then it only magnifies and gets stronger, right? So it's a difficult thing to kind of grasp. Now, if we, so here's where I'm going to start going down off the deep end a little bit here. So this is an Ecuadorian doubloon that there's chapter 99 in Moby Dick, right? It's called the doubloon. And what happens is all of the characters, Captain Ahab goes up to it and he reads into it the symbols, right? There are the peaks of the Andes, there's a rooster, there's a star, there's suns, the sun, the zodiac sign is in Libra, all that kind of stuff. And he, being a narcissist, reads it as a symbol of his success against the killing of the whale, right? It's all about me, right? It's, that kind of thing. Starbuck, the first mate, who's the devout, sort of faithful person, goes into it and reads the three peaks of the Andes as the Holy Trinity. And this is a sign, and there's a valley, and there's a river between it, so there's a long path, and he reads his own symbolism into that, right? Another another one of the mates comes in and is just like, oh, it's the cycle of life. The guy that's very open-hearted and just kind of comical. He's like, oh yeah, we go through this whole ordeal and we come out peachy in the end and everything's all great, right? And the last one looks at it and says, well, it's worth $16 in gold, right? The pragmatist. And I could buy this many drams of tobacco with it, right? And so it's kind of a really interesting concept here because like that subjective interpretation, I think, is only allowable when you have that certain degree of ambiguity in something, right? And I think like eventually when I start showing my own work here, it's going to be not so much that it is a successful execution of that, but more just kind of identify what that struggle is, right? So in the, if you also take, let's say, a great film, Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, right? If we think about the narrative structure of that, it's essentially about, you know, 4 characters witness the same crime, witness the same series of events, and have a very, very different interpretation. And so coming out of that, this overwhelming sense of what is the meaning of any of this, right? Who's right? And we start realizing that we don't necessarily have, you know, an idea of what the truth is. And so that's an idea that's always fascinated me in literature too. If you take, what is it, The Catcher in the Rye, right? Or if you take Taxi Driver, right? Or if you take The Heart of Darkness, or a more contemporary interpretation of that, Apocalypse Now, right? You're sort of on this ride of moral ambiguity, of, you know, not knowing what the actual situation is about, right? And I think that that's probably the most potent combination that's possible here. So this kind of leads me a little bit to some strange images here. These are from what's called a thematic apperception test, right? Which is a clinical test that was developed by Alexander Murray in the 1930s, sort of as a response to the Rorschach test, right? One of his graduate students, her son was sick with the flu or something like that, and noticed that her little child was tearing out images from magazines and making up these little stories. So the idea was that she planted this idea in Dr. Murray's mind, right? Could this be a plausible way of kind of testing somebody's outlook, right? By creating these images. And so during the Works Project Administration in the 1930s, what they started commissioning a whole bunch of artists to do these sort of what they called charged but ambiguous images. Now, kind of weird part about them is there's hardly any ambiguity in this, right? There's, I mean, pretty clear, right? But it's kind of an interesting thing, you know, very Thomas Hart Benton images. So a lot of the artists of the time were contributing to the plates of this clinical test here. And what's kind of neat about it is that when you're kind of reading about different people's interpretations, people will have a ton of different ideas. Like, I have a very clear idea of what I think is going on in this, right? As do many of you. And those are going to be fundamentally really different, which kind of identifies, I think, this idea of the kind of subjective experience, right? Or the idea of the viewer actually having a participatory action within the interpretation of art, right? And this one I just kind of added because it's so not ambiguous, but and that image. So now, if we kind of go into sort of a little bit of the mental processes here. So this is a plate from probably every psychology book ever developed, every psychology textbook. It's an illusion that sort of identifies the difference between kind of top-down and bottom-up processing, right? So if you haven't seen this before and you don't know what it is, right? Often, and as when I first saw this, I was just like, what is that, right? Couldn't make out an image at all, right? And so what's happening in your mind is you're searching through this sort of encyclopedia of known things, right? What could it be, right? Am I seeing anything that's recognizable within this image? And so you're really going from like a sort of bottom-up process, right? Then when you suddenly, it dawns on you what the actual subject is, right? Then you will never see this without knowing what the subject is again, right? Just by a show of hands, how many of you can actually tell what it is? Oh, wow, okay, later on I'll spoil it for you. But, you know, and there have been experiments just recently, last week, I believe, on National Public Radio, was this great thing where they had a sound, a sentence that was being spoken, and it was totally garbled, and you couldn't make it out. Then they tell you what the sentence is, and then you can't not hear it for what the sentence is, right? And it's kind of this fascinating thing. Now, when that occurs, right, you start going, when you have that moment, when you see it, right? If you didn't see it immediately, suddenly it comes into focus, you have a response with your limbic system, right? You have this like moment where you're kind of shocked into this kind of clarity, right? Which I think is also potentially a really powerful element. Now, if we remove thresholds of things, like if you take a film still, this is from just some random film in the 1920s, right? You take it out of its context, you remove movement, you remove all of these kind of things. We are sort of like teetering on this very strange threshold where we start going through that, and perhaps unlike the illusion that we saw earlier, right? This is one of those things, if you don't know the context, you probably won't be able to make out really anything. Maybe there's a figure in there, maybe there isn't, you know, who knows? And so we're in this constant state of searching for meaning, right? In our subject, in, you know, our existence, that kind of stuff. You know, another one where it might start getting a little bit more clear, but now you start seeing that there's a flexibility in terms of mood, right? Is this a sinister image? Is it a heartwarming experience? Are they just on a joyride in their old, you know, Model T or whatever that car is? What's going on in this image? And I think there are a lot of artists that have sort of functioned really effectively in this language here, right? So this is, I forget the name of the series. It's Gerhard Richter, the September 77. It's about the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany. And so he's taking an image and just essentially like wiping out, like reducing its threshold to almost the point of unrecognizability, right? But a lot of these images were known by the public, right? These were basically like the Zapruder films to Americans, right? The Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination. These were so etched in the consciousness of, you know, Germans in the 1970s, right? These images, that there was that kind of moment where you're looking at this blur, and these are like huge paintings, you know, have almost zero threshold to them. You almost can't make them out until you're like 45 feet away from them. You know, another one, a funeral procession from the same series, right? And how effectively that works as a picture, sort of teetering on that edge between description and abstraction, right? If we kind of go back in time a little bit, a lot of the artists, like in this case Edwin Dickinson, right, was really, I think, especially in his paintings as well as his drawings, is really operating on that level of kind of understanding the power of abstraction. And he was interesting, like as a teacher at the League too, he was one of the few figurative artists that was embraced by the abstract expressionists, and one of the few like abstract-ish contemporary avant-garde artists that was really accepted by the figurative painters and draftspeople. So he was a huge influence to me. Like this one, another Dickinson drawing, where it's almost like, okay, I think that's a lion. I'm not really 100% sure, but it's just this compelling image, right? And seems more evocative by that idea of not quite understanding what's going on in the image there, right? Now, so if we take, this is a piece by Walter Tandy Murch, one of his more recognizable ones, a lot of his drawings, right, I think really operate like taking out of the experience of, a standard still life, where everything is hyper represented. He talked a lot about how he's not interested so much in the object itself, but is interested between the air between him as the observer and the object, or the sound that the object makes, right? As kind of dealing with, I think, a lot of really interesting things for a representational painter. And it was surprising to me, like, how coherent and representational his pieces are. He was studying with Arshile Gorky and a lot of more cutting-edge avant-garde people, at the time, and was exhibiting with Pollock and Jasper Johns and Bob Rauschenberg at the Betty Parsons Gallery. One of his drawings where he starts introducing a little bit of the kind of, one of the big elements of the zeitgeist at the time was the chance occurrence, right? If you take the music of John Cage, who was putting, prepared pianos, putting erasers and nuts and bolts and things like that, having a certain influence on the work itself, like applying a structure to it, but then also having a form of entropy, right, within that. Merce Cunningham, a lot of the conceptual artists at the time were dealing with that element. And he was doing that more and more. His early work was very ultra-representational. He was an illustrator for Scientific American and a lot of things like that. But then you start seeing him getting into this power of the piece where he's just breaking that threshold down. And the pieces, I think, just become more and more poignant, right? It's like a pen and ink, ink charcoal drawing of his of a rock. I think this one was titled The Meteor. I'm not really sure, though. Then, on the other hand, right, you have this other thing where I was finding, like, throughout my life, Japanese woodblock prints, and especially like shunga pieces, right, are so, like, so we're doing an about face here for a second, right, are so loaded with narrative, right? These were descriptive books, right? These, the shunga pieces, right, kind of telling a story where it maybe wasn't clear enough, there's all this writing on the side, right? And kind of getting to this idea where you're getting some pretty intense subject matters in a lot of, like, the, if you take like a battle scene by Yoshitoshi, it's just a bloodbath, right? If you're taking a lot of the erotic prints of Hokusai and some Hiroshige ones, you're finding, like, wow, how does that function? Because you have such a clarity of the subject matter, right? And then you start kind of getting into this idea of is there an interface, like, with the stylization of the form, right? Is that helping as a vehicle? So another piece. The last two, I'm not 100% sure. They look to me like they're Utamaros, but I'm not 100% sure. This next piece is definitely an Utamaro, right? And in a lot of ways, like, so we take this abstract structure of these works, and that seems to be the thing that kind of overrides the design sensibility, the thing that kind of overrides even the subject matter itself, right? We don't look at this as a, if it's a Yoshitoshi, as just like, oh, a gratuitously violent picture, nor do we look at this as a pornographic image, right? And I think that that's a really kind of critical thing. We're overwhelmed by the art objectness of this, right? And that's a very difficult thing to kind of attain, right? So in kind of going into, and I'll explain a little bit about, like, what the Decameron is, right, in a little while here, and kind of the working process of that. These are woodblocks by Frans Masseriel, who's a Flemish graphic artist that made the first sort of one of the first wordless novels of the time. This one's from The City, where he's showing just really sort of in a serial form, right? You get this linear narrative, you're turning pages. So there's image 1, there's image 2, there's image 5, whatever. But each one of them is sort of disparate, right? It sort of has nothing to do with the other piece. They're tied together by their, by their stylistic considerations, but they're fundamentally different. Like one might be a scene of squalor, one might be a humorous scene, one might be a really sad, tragic scene, as you can see here, right? And so that idea of having something, as a draftsperson and visual artist, whatever, at least I always think about the one piece that's important is the one that you're working on, right? When it comes down to it, nothing else matters. The precedence for it doesn't matter. The pieces before it, the pieces after it don't matter. It's just the efficacy of that one single piece. But then what happens when you start putting it into a linear narrative? What happens when you start kind of taking some inspiration from literature, which is a very linear progression through a narrative, right? Or if you're taking a film, something that you're starting and ending at a certain point, what happens when you start piecing together images within a certain context, right? Are some of the questions. Now, like material-wise, so graphite has always been just like my default working material, right? This is a piece by Robert Riggs, sort of very underappreciated artist of the 20th century. And a lot of these pieces are lithographs. And so lithography has a kind of very peculiar sensibility about it, right? It's a greasy thing. It's drawn on stone. It kind of, after the whole printing process thing, it leaves these like ridiculously insane blacks, right? That are just can't be competed with. If you're familiar with like Kathy Kollwitz's lithographs and things like that, they're just like as a component of that, or the potential of the material, it starts setting up a different kind of sensibility and almost formal quality to it, like where things are much more graphic on one level. That's an interesting sound. This is a boxer preparing for a fight, another lithograph by Robert Riggs. And one of his more exhaustive ones, more resolved ones, I should say. And so, like, one of the things about his work that I just really love is this, like, very formal element of dynamic design, right, which never becomes decorative, right? Thing about his work that none of it is pretty, right? All of it is just this brutal, banal, just kind of like crazy thing. But within that is so much gracefulness, right? And how do you navigate those very opposing worlds, right? Within the construction of work, which now I guess starts leading me into the Decameron itself, right? So we've just gone through something kind of spectacular that humanity has gone through pretty much every 100 years for as long as we can remember, right? The plague, right? Or our version of it, right? We had the Spanish influenza in 1912, something like that, going all the way back to the bubonic plague. And the Decameron was one of the first real, like, I guess you could call it novels, written in kind of Renaissance Italy, and was a response to the bubonic plague, right? So a bunch of people, long story short, they leave town to escape the plague, and they sort of shelter in place. They go into their own version of quarantine, and they decide that they're going to tell stories to each other, right? And so the stories kind of run the gamut. It's just this like kind of incredible trip where you go from one like moralistic story, from a very religious standpoint, to the like lewd and lascivious, the next story, and all of these things are just really kind of, you almost feel like your brain's going through a ping pong match, right? Reading all of these stories. These are illustrations by Rockwell Kent, who illustrated this. I believe it was like the 1920s. I'm not 100% sure on that, but did his own interpretation. And the thing that's really effective about this, if you've ever seen the Decameron, it's a tome, right? It's a big, thick book. And scattered throughout the book are maybe 20 illustrations that he did, and none of them are illustrations, really, of the story. They're just like kind of loosely evocative of what's going on in the thing, right? And I think this work, if you're familiar with, I should have included perhaps some of Rockwell Kent's illustrations for Moby Dick, right, are, you know, very different from these. And it's kind of interesting to see an artist that then starts facing, you know, a different subject matter, a different time period, and deciding to do illustrations of that. So I think the kind of neat element of his work is really the humor in them, right? They just seem kind of over the top and whimsical. And so those ideas were always banging through my head over this time, like how could I really start getting the figure back into work and feel comfortable about it, right? Or how could I feel uncomfortable about it, but in that way that makes you feel like, I'm doing something all right here, right? You know, because it's a really difficult thing when you don't really have a precedence of what you actually want out of the work, but you're kind of working through it. And so this is, as I may have mentioned in the beginning, I forget, it's been 36 minutes already, talking about that strange dilemma of like, is this working or not, but then also presenting something that's a work in progress, right? I don't know about all of you folks here, but when I'm working on a drawing or something, it's like that studio is off limits. No one's going to look at it because you don't want that Rembrandt thing to happen. You've all heard that story. Somebody came in and he has this work in progress, and somebody says, "Wow, those are the best pearls I've ever seen painted," and he sat there for about 20 minutes and then just took a palette knife and scraped the pearls out because he knew that that was eventually a curse on the work, right? So I'll talk just a little bit about like what leads into this. Like a lot of this is, you know, starting off, a lot of the works are essentially just thumbnail sketches, mostly from imagination, sometimes, you know, based loosely on film stills or whatever, anything that you could identify. A lot of these, in this case, just kind of started off as an abstract blur with a big triangle on the bottom of the page, and then you start kind of finding figures within that and seeing if this is done in like magic marker and charcoal or something like that from a sketchbook page. Another one a little bit more resolved, to try to see like what happens with the narrative, what happens with the abstract composition. One of the things that I always do is before starting anything is a bunch of compositional studies where I'm kind of looking at the tonal structure, looking at like what is the abstract design, like where does your eye move through an image, how do you read the image, because you can never tell until it's just at least translated to a two-dimensional surface, right? And then trying also to get a little bit into subject matter that on one hand is kind of humorous, but then it's also a little bit edgier, right? And I think like that's something that has always been a difficult struggle, you know. So other more abstract ones, even changing like eye level, like trying to think about like what would happen if you're seeing a scene or something from above. Checking out the abstract patterning, finding forms within that to kind of serve as a framework and kind of looking at the kind of general dynamics that are within the pieces. And I'll start getting into the series itself. It's strange giving a monologue because usually when I was telling Dan earlier how we're both used to when we're giving lectures, we have our back to an audience and we're drawing on something and talking about it and asking questions of people. But so kind of going through this group, like what I wanted to really do with it was to kind of experiment with what happens if you really become an unreliable narrator. What if you have a colleague of mine, a sculptor, showed me this amazing article on an essay on Anselm Kiefer. I think it was called The Slippage, but it's about lateral slippage of the narrative, which I thought was just the perfect explanation. In Anselm Kiefer's case, you know, it was really kind of taking like how he has very sort of right-wing imagery coupled with very left-wing imagery. Let's just kind of simplify it there. But kind of looking at like what would happen if you even changed the time period? What if you had something where you have a narrative structure where something is, and this is designed to be the first piece in the series, right? The Plague Doctors, right? So it's something that's a little bit more clearly identifiable, maybe placed a little bit more in time, and giving me the opportunity at least to really work with a lot of varying subject matters, you know, like with, as I kind of mentioned, like one of the biggest dangers I think is like, for myself at least, is when you start becoming a caricature of yourself, right? It's like, well, I did this piece, now to have the next piece, it should be this, and it should be that, and it should fit in this, you know, essentially like a thesis statement, right? And it ends up just becoming almost like a false thing. So trying to then like kind of take more contemporary things, sometimes imagery that you don't identify what it is necessarily, right? Or having like what was at one point the center of interest of this, there's a figure in this, have that completely removed so that you start like degrading the image or redacting certain elements of it to really test out the shapes. This was, there's a piece in Los Caprichos by Goya, where there's the, you know, one of the goblins or something with his wings, and sort of used that as a foundation for the structure of this piece. Not that you'd be able to tell that, but those are the things that were going through my mind. You know, to things that are a little bit more kind of tangible and more based on actual experience, you know? So like trying to see what would happen if you're coupling things that you are very familiar with fantasy. What happens if you take, you know, the totally real and familiar, and then have that juxtaposed against an image that is completely absurd or arbitrary, or something that is more in a sort of fantasy realm, right? And these are not in their final order, and I'll mention too, this is probably maybe about half of the entire series. A lot have been edited out for this too. You know, taking the foundation of the abstract image, and I'll just kind of skip through 3 to try to even play with this idea, like what would happen if you had a linear sequence of events within a series there. So those 3 were kind of loosely related to one another, right? That's very touch sensitive. So also, like when you start getting into things like that I've always, you know, talking about the shunga and the relationship of Japanese erotic artwork and stuff like that, is there a way to stylistically kind of create, and I'm not sure if I can or if I'm succeeding at all at it, but it's a question that I think it's a very fulfilling question, at least to ask myself, right? Like, is it plausible to kind of create that loaded subject matter, whether it's an erotic scene, if it's a violent scene, if it's, could be either, right? You know, and sort of see like, is there a mode of kind of taking the abstract quality of that image and having it, to a certain extent, still retain a certain essence of its banality, but then also to kind of transcend that into something that's hopefully a little bit bigger than pure banality, right? And ultra banal. And like a lot of images, like more and more, they're getting to be like relationships of like trying to almost create something that's so abstract, but hopefully knowing, like I might know what the subject matter is or have an idea in mind, but then also like to see where the different interpretations will come from through those through the interpretations of the pieces, and then even seeing like when I'm putting the pieces up, having them, I have one sequence, change the order of the sequence, and the narrative to me changes completely, right? And so also in trying to figure out like when this whole body of work is done, like, how am I going to exhibit that? Like, how do you communicate that idea, right? And realizing, like, the addition of one piece or taking out a certain piece, it totally ruptures or creates a different narrative within the structure itself, right? Oops, sorry. So, and then, like, a lot of the pieces too are sort of, as you saw before, some of them are like really basic still lives, and those are sort of kind of like a nod to like Tarkovsky's films, right? Where in a lot of his shots, he'll have this, you know, movement forward, but then there's a pause on a mountain, right? Or a pause on a wall or something like that. And I think like having things like that, like where you really start changing the cadence of a piece based on what's around it, right? Could be one direction for inquiry that I'm still trying to kind of understand with that. It's amazing, like, not to make this whole thing about Herman Melville and Moby Dick or anything like that, but in Moby Dick, like, there are these like really weird chapters, like where, what's it called, cetology or something. It's about the life cycle of whales and these whales and stuff like that. And you're sitting there and just like, really, do I really need this? Should I skip over this? What it does, though, is it puts you on that 3-year voyage, on that whaling voyage. Like, it changes your cadence. And like following the pulse of that book, like from the very beginning, it's kind of high speed, and he meets the whaler and Queequeg and all that kind of stuff, and they're on a boat, and then it slows down. And then it's just like this, like the action of the wave. And then it starts picking up pace again until the end. It's just a frenzy, and like, oh my God, the book's over. I didn't want it to end. So, and then with this piece and a couple of other ones too, like really trying to almost see like what happens when you kind of jump time period, right? Like a lot of the work that Neo Rauch, German contemporary artist, his work, Michael Boremann's, you know, Sigmar Polk, a lot of their artwork seems to kind of really freely navigate this like sense of nostalgia, right? This kind of pain for the loss of the past idea, like where, you know, it's almost dateable, but in a lot of ways, like their work becomes timeless. And so like trying to find like, what is that ubiquitous sort of American sort of image? Like, you know, film noir, if it's, you know, kind of scenes of, you know, the Great Depression, is it a contemporary scene? So trying to kind of think about experimenting with things like that in the work. This is one of the first pieces I did for the Decameron series before I even knew it was like going to be what it is or what it's becoming. So that's like mixed media. I think it's oil and acrylic and ink and enamel paint. And then, you know, sometimes too, like kind of getting into, you know, again, like what the meaning is of the pieces. I want to kind of see if those are clear, if they're evident, if they're not, if they, you know, if they change their relationship depending on what the other images are. Then kind of getting into some like more, just, I guess, kind of, I guess, more planted, more narrative or more descriptive elements of subject matter, then even getting into things that are a little bit more edgy. This is sort of like directly lifted from a Hokusai that kind of took that and sort of fleshed it out, and also sort of a nod to Duchamp's État donné at the Pennsylvania Museum of Fine Arts. Back to things that are a little bit more tangible and recognizable, and things that are directly related. And then, even though there are a lot of pieces in between this is to be the final piece. It's the largest of all of them, and this one's still in progress. And so that's pretty much it for that present. Oh, there's a couple more. It was out of order, and another one of the still life things. So that's pretty much the visual presentation. 50 minutes, not bad. Okay. So any Any questions or anything?
So, Michael, can you hear me?
Yep.
It's totally fascinating, and I think everybody's blown away and really inspired to think very deeply about the kinds of images that they want to make. So I have a question for you. It kind of goes to what you continue to look for, because this has been a time of such horrendous loss and just people feeling disillusioned by life. And I was just thinking about how, the imagery that you're creating at some point in the future, like in 2100 or 2200, nobody's going to remember what this time felt like. And so the sense of this era is going to be held within, like suspended within your imagery. And so which of the images you have created, do you feel comes the closest to that visceral sense of what you're looking for? And what do you continue to search for?
Yeah, well, so I think it's a great question. That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Like, in a lot of ways, like I think, like the book, The Decameron, right? I think it was an escapist book, right? I think it was essentially like, okay, a bunch of people are fleeing, right? But then also, how are they getting out of their own minds, right? So they start kind of going into this whole fantasy world where they're telling these fantastic stories about, with morality and all that kind of stuff. And they're deviating from the fact that they're in quarantine. They're just locked in the same room with someone, so they're kind of projecting this amazing fantasy life on something. I think for myself, like the series, the interesting thing about it was a way for me to depart from what the normal thing is, drawing stuff that's around me directly, right? And through that, like, it was going into this fantasy stuff, it was going into, like, scenes of violence and erotica and all this kind of stuff, and then kind of realizing the baseline and the pieces that I respond to the most, actually, ironically, are the ones that are a little bit more touching back into what my existence is. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's sort of like, it's kind of gone through a wave, right? Kind of taking this whole thing where in that inner turmoil, and every single one of us in one way or the other has gone through an absolute upheaval during this time period, right? And it seemed like in my attempt to kind of get away from that, to go into fantasy, into like doing spaceships marooned on, Europa or something like that, right? In a way, it just kind of returned me back to what I think my work is really about, which is kind of an examination and trying to find a meaning of what's directly around me. So I think, if anything, those are going to be the pieces that kind of continue on, that once I sort of say goodbye to this whole thing, it seems like the lighter pieces too are beginning to kind of pull me into this whole world that's really responding more directly to what I know, which is the world that I'm in, But having come through this tunnel that was, processed through Japanese woodblock prints, or processed through looking at Robert Riggs's work, or looking at like all of these different kind of ideas of that narrative. So, if that makes any sense. And then I think in the end, like when you look at work, from 500 years ago, right? You don't know exactly what the time period was, but I think you're just left with a tone, like if it's the frescoes in Pompeii, right? Or if it's, an illuminated manuscript, there's something that tells you about the human condition through the imagery and the iconography and all of those elements, so that the factual stuff doesn't really matter, right? There we go back to the unreliable narrator. It's like, does it really matter, what the truth of it is? It's
Interesting, yeah. We have a number of questions through the chat, but do we want to take one in the room? Let me pass the mic over to you.
Thank you. Is this good? Are we? Yes? Okay. Hello.
okay.
I was really fascinated by hearing how you looked at not only movie stills for the abstraction, but also kind of going into Japanese woodblock prints for this kind of borderline of things that are tangible, but also kind of wrapped in this abstraction and even design, both obviously the two-dimensional, but then the narrative, how it also straddles like violence and erotica. And I wanted to know if you also look at Japanese sumi ink print or sumi ink drawings, because I find those really fascinating because they're in monochrome.
Yeah.
And that limitation almost of the, well, for them, that wasn't really limited because they did like a whole bunch of stuff with the sumi ink brush.
Yeah.
But I always found those spaces in those ink drawings to be really like, I don't know, like, I think that what you said about that aspect of limitation I found really fascinating. I wanted to know if you looked at any like ink drawings.
Yeah, I do. And the thing, it's interesting, we could talk about this forever, and in some ways, like the, you know, especially with the sumi ink stuff, you know, I could be completely wrong about this, right? But Japan strikes me as a very strong assimilation culture, right? They had a lot of influences, but what they did was then they changed all of those influences, right? So the sumi work is very atmospheric too, like much more than you know, the woodblock, the precisionist sort of linear things that we know of, like when we think of hokusai, you know, or hiroshige or something like that. You know, and it's interesting because it kind of starts almost responding more to its precursors, like Chinese artwork, right? And the fluidity of the ink and the design elements of that. And it's interesting because I love that work too, but I don't look at it so much because it seems more tackling things that I'm trying to tackle with, right? And so like with the woodblocks, what's amazing for me is that, you know, on a lot of levels, it's like I can't comprehend like how the style even works within it, you know, and I'm fascinated by that, you know, like, you know, we have examples of that in you know, let's say Otto Dix in some ways, you know, has a very strong stylistic change of people's morphology to do something, right? But they're kind of participating in caricature, you know, and that kind of stuff deliberately. And then with Japanese woodblock prints, I see it as a very, like, because it's, in a lot of ways, it's foreign to me, right, in terms of its overall, in terms of the stylistic consideration, and even the kind of tone of, like, what goes into the work, right, is different. But how well that operates within those languages, I find really, really interesting. And in a lot of ways, like, there's similarities, right, between, you know, art all over the place. Certain things, dynamics are functioning, the way your eye moves into it for it to be, you know, an effective delivery of what its content is. But it's one that is just, its format doesn't come from the Baroque, where I feel very comfortable. You know what I mean? It's an amazing thing. And color, you know, and a lot of the color relationships too are so perplexing. You know, in some ways, the strong experimentations that, let's say, Yoshitoshi was doing when pigments were first, you know, arriving now in the 19th century, right? And utilizing that versus like earlier pieces like the Hokusai, where there's a very deliberate, you know, okay, it's that orange, and then there's that weird sort of turquoise, that muted turquoise, along with the beige paper, and it works on a harmonic, much the way a Titian works, I think. You know, totally different pigments, right? Totally different outlook, but.
We have another question through the chat online. Nick Reynolds. Hey, Nick, thanks for joining us. He would like to know if you could please speak more to how pure abstraction can operate as a narrative element, i.e., how does abstraction function in relation to the literal objective elements?
So, Nick, one of my best friends ever, he always asks the tough questions, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, if you take like a Motherwell painting, there's a sort of, or let's say you take a Motherwell compared to a Rothko, right? You can't say that they really necessarily have a narrative, but they have like a pulse. You know what I mean? Like a certain, like, a thing that drives you through the construction of the image, right? If we take the even these, you know, arbitrary abstraction things, let me just kind of go back to find the film still. So if you take an image like this, right, it's a pure abstraction, right, in some ways. It might have a foundation representational imagery, but your eye moves through it, right? You sort of have a kind of pulse about it. You know, if we're kind of looking at verticality in an image or patterns, things like that, I think they have the capability of sort of building you into the potential of at least an ambiguous narrative, if that makes any sense. It's you know, it's not going to tell you a story, an illustration, but it can leave a certain tone, right? We could look at this, one person might see it as spirit photography, right? One person might see it as, you know, is it a scene from Fritz Lang's M, right? Is it, you know, no one really knows what it is, right? Or I don't even remember what film this is from, honestly. But what abstraction means, what abstract means, it means something being taken out of its appropriate context, right? And I think in that way, that's how abstraction can help to operate and kind of alter the way that narrative is delivered, right? If we could sort of accept that idea that a Robert Motherwell has a narrative to it, right? It doesn't have it's non-objective, so it doesn't have a literal narrative within that, but it has a cadence, it has a pulse, it has a certain movement through it. We take a Rothko, it has a very different sort of somber type of thing, and I think that abstract quality changes that. If we look at the abstract elements, the formal elements of Japanese woodblock prints, right? It's a very similar thing. It's utilizing that abstract design to motivate the narrative. Or, boy, a great example of that, I remember when I was at the Art Students League passing by an abstract class, and always like kind of fascinated, like what do they talk about in there? They're not going to be talking about anatomy, right? What do they talk about? And the person giving the presentation had a slideshow, and on the wall was a Rubens. And he's comparing that to Jackson Pollock. And suddenly you're standing there looking at the two and you're like, oh my gosh, they are built almost identically on the same structure, right? You know, and in both of them, it's facilitating your movement through this like modernist frenetic nightmare scene of the Pollock, right, the drip painting, or it's taking you through the Massacre of the Innocents, which is really the same, right? This sense of kind of dread and that abstract drive. If you can picture that painting in your mind, right? There's like babies on the ground that have been beaten to death. There's like one about to be flung into a wall, and there's this big crescendo and this big arc that just kind of runs through the image. And all of that is that delivery, I think, or the power of the abstract design. And if you blur it out, if you look at it from like 300 feet away, there's still something that conveys its violence or its narrative within that image, if that makes any sense. Or I just evaded the question.
No, it does. It does. It's really tough stuff to get into verbally because it's a visual medium. But I'd love to ask something to kind of piggyback on what Nick was asking, which is when you yourself, you know, speaking of pictorial structure and the genesis of an idea, do you find yourself generally beginning with a kind of a visual abstraction and then looking for the feeling contained within that? Or do you come up with a thematic idea and then try to create an abstraction around the idea?
Yeah, when I come up with the thematic idea first, it usually radically fails, right? Because I start like trying to say, okay, I want somebody to feel this. And so I'm thinking about it in literal terms, in words, right? And then it kind of falls flat. So most of the time, you know, they're even started with scribbles or, you know, Da Vinci talked about this a lot. Supposedly in his, in the treatise, he writes about how the Battle of Anghiari was concepted from a stain on his wall. Who knows if that's true? Maybe it was a Vasari, one of his, you know, fanciful stories. But you could almost see that, like where the kind of movement of the Battle of Anghiari, yeah, kind of looks like ink spots or stains on a plaster wall or something like that. So a lot of the time, like I'm starting them with that idea of abstraction. Like those are the ones that sort of work a little bit more effectively, and then you're like maybe starting off with a diagonal, and then suddenly, oh, that kind of looks like a leg, let's go with it, right? And so in my sketchbook, there's usually like dozens of things, and then the narrative starts coming out, or the kind of content starts making itself apparent, and then trying to maintain a certain level of the abstraction too. You know, because I think when they collapse, it could be either that it's so abstract that you lose the ballast, right? Or it could be so tangible that it's like, okay, interesting, it's a person murdering somebody else, or it's a car, or it's a little doggy, right, whatever, and then you move on, right? So for me, it's like, I think the more effective ones are starting really with that idea of responding to the abstraction, right? So, or at least what I'm trying to do with these. Work from direct observation a little less, like you're kind of, you know, looking at something and you respond to something. Why am I compelled by that thing in the corner, right? Or the lighting on that. Then trying to kind of bring that into an abstract level, right? That's where those like thumbnail sketches come in, because then it's like, wait, what's the essence of this? It's just a dark shape, it's just a light shape, or it's a checkerboard, you know? That's what you read from a distance, and then trying to kind of maintain some of that element as well, right? I mean, film operates on that too. Like, if you take any film still out of its context, so often it's just like a blur of movement between one shot and another, right? And so it almost becomes meaningless. And I like really would love to be able to kind of operate on that level, like where it's just coming into focus, but you don't get the full fulfillment, sort of like that, like the Dickinson drawing or something like that, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. So even when you enlarge it, it kind of changes, right? It evolves, and it even changes in its feeling and its read and its pictorial structure. So.
Yeah, and then like formally or technically, like when in working on things too, it's like sometimes you develop something and it totally, that might be the best leg you've ever drawn in your life, and then, but it doesn't operate for the picture, so then the sandpaper comes out, right? Or, you know, something to obliterate it, to sort of free you from that curse, you know what I mean? And it's a really interesting relationship, like that creation-destruction language that I don't think I really participated in as much as I am now. Not that that's the right thing, or if it's going to be a lifelong emphasis, but that idea of kind of allowing yourself to, you know, like a sand mandala or whatever they're, you know, where you're willing to let that thing that you've clung so desperately to dissolve and collapse, right?
Okay.
So.
Yeah, thank you for that. Helena Larota. Hi, Helena. Thanks for joining us. Would like to know if there are any contemporary recent literature examples that inspire you, like the way the classical ones do.
I wouldn't say so contemporary. I'm a little like stuck in my ways, but like, oh gosh. What was the one one I had a really tough relationship with was Mailer. Like, just, there's, oh, what's his first name? Help me out here. Norman Mailer, that's it. So, in a lot of his books, he's a really kind of despicable type of writer in so many ways, but then also like really poetic in other ways. You know, the one that I've really gotten into, again, not contemporary, but Nabokov. Like his poetry is just unbelievable. Like it is just, it's incredible. And that's I mean, he's a great example too. Like, you know, it's almost been wiped out of any discussion, but if you take Lolita, right, it's a deranged book in a lot of ways. but then the delivery of it, the language within that is just so, it's some of the best writing ever. Like, how does that happen? You know what I mean? So that's probably as close. I haven't been reading a lot of contemporary pieces. With the exception of Cormac McCarthy, who's just phenomenal too. And talk about that edge. Like, Blood Meridian is like the most, I mean, brutal, any of his books, The Road, Blood Meridian, that kind of thing. This really amazing like cadence of his language that I think kind of hits that chord, especially with Blood Meridian.
Again, interesting. I would have thought you'd be answering with more film because of the examples recently from that amazing interview that you and Amaya did with Deakins. You're looking at a lot of cinematography continuously, right?
Yeah, like, I mean, film is my love. It's so like you can process it. It's different from reading a book where all of the imagery is generated by you, the reader. A film is very much about like kind of accepting somebody else's visual art form. And yeah, movies are amazing. Like, I just rewatched, what was it, Raging Bull. And it's just epic and in its visual sensibility. Even things like Apocalypse Now, as I mentioned, it's like, I think that's an improvement on, I love the book Heart of Darkness, but wow, like, this film took that into a whole new language, and one that kind of struck our generation, and because we respond a little bit more, in using the analogy of the colonial sort of point of view of the Heart of Darkness, but then kind of taking it and placing it in Vietnam, and was just a brilliant move. Like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fascinating. Another question, if that's all right?
Yeah.
Grace Athena Flott, thank you for joining us. Would like to comment, brilliant work. Do you think the representational figure can fall prey to objectification and consumption by the viewer? Is abstraction a way around this? Does it allow greater agency for the subject?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do, is also to come to grips with that as well. Like, that idea of objectification is a really tricky one, and it's one that our culture has to start asking itself. What is the responsibility that one has when you're representing a certain thing, right? In a lot of ways, just, I would like to believe that it's the intention that is going to alter that, but that's not the case. We've seen plenty of pieces that have good intention about how they're being presented or how they're being like responsibly thought of, but fall into that mode where it becomes, objectifies something. Now, in some ways, I think the really tricky question about that is like, what does objectification mean? It sort of means that you're kind of taking away, or the way I look at it, the personal qualities of something. You're sort of taking the human behind the nude, if we kind of deal with, let's say, that aspect of it, right? And then so, is abstraction going to help that, or is it actually going to make it worse in some ways? Because you're essentially dehumanizing even further, right? And so that's something that I think is a really tricky thing to ask, and something that, like, I try not to ask it when I'm doing the work itself, but the second that pencil sits down, it's like, these are things that we have to kind of ask ourselves as human beings right now. Like, what does it mean to participate in that, to objectify something? Is the mere fact of my looking at something objectifying that in a negative way? Or is it trying to get at a balance between subjective interpretation and objective truth of that? So I don't have an answer, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, I agree, but that presumes that objectification is always pejorative, but sometimes what you're doing is idealizing, right? As you interpret what you see.
Yeah, that's a really tricky a tricky thing to kind of navigate as well. Like, I think in a lot of ways, the second you start putting something down on paper, you're kind of creating a certain idealization, let's say, right? You're trying to create a little perfect world, whether that means through, you know, degraded surfaces or by a finely wrought Van Eyck Memling type of surface, you know, that type of thing. And it's, yeah, it's a really, that light just dimmed out, and yeah, it's a really, it's a tough thing, like, then to kind of figure out, like, then with idealization, where does that kind of fall into place? Like, then if you're idealizing something, are you projecting too much of your own subjective reality on something? And then in a way, you're losing the components of what you're seeing. And then as a result, are you then objectifying, right? It's kind of, it's a really tricky relationship. And we're in a time where we do have to ask those questions. Like, I think that becomes, not to the point of preventing us from working, but I think just like, what is the responsibility of what we do? Like, what, how does society change, right? How are the necessities of artists as visual communicators altering constantly, right? We could do that on our own, right? When your work is kind of going out in the public, I think we have a big, you know, responsibility to do so respectfully, right? I mean, another thing is like, hey, I'm just freely admitting that I'm culturally misappropriating Japanese woodblock prints, right? Mm-hmm. I feel actually okay about that because Japanese art was defined by that, you know, in a really positive way. But it wasn't done so with malice. It was done out of respect, right? Japanese art looked at, let's say, Chinese art as an influence, and it wasn't like, well, I'm going to take this and I'm going to do something that's better than that. They took that, studied it for sometimes centuries, and then really assimilated it so it became part of their own. I don't know if that makes any sense, or if that sounds kind of like, you know, if that's, but.
No, it makes sense to me. I mean, when you're working, you're carrying a lot of ideas that come from your studies over the years and your experiences in the museums, your understanding of anatomy. There's a lot that's in your head, and as you put things down, you're always altering what you see based upon the things that are even in your memory, or the way you want to affect feeling within the piece. So it makes total sense to me. You have that, you carry it with you anyway, but it's just a matter of organizing it, right?
Yeah, and I think, like, in a lot of ways, like, it would do us a lot of good. Like, here on the other end of it, it's like, coming from the education that I did, I've come from, it was really about Western canon. You know, it's like, that was it. Like, that was pretty much all we knew. And then, you know, the stuff, you know, when you're looking at, I don't know, like, certain works, it's like, oh, it's because this influenced the Impressionists. You know, Japanese woodblock print was essentially reduced to how it affected the Impressionists in the way that I was taught art history. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of really not such a great way of kind of going about things, you know, when it comes down to, like, whoa, my gosh, like, you look at the breadth of, you know, whether it's Japanese artwork or, you know, art from ancient Mesopotamia or something like that. All of those things really, you know, that is part of what we're within right now, which is really global culture, right? Mm-hmm. It's, so.
Excellent. There's a question from Lourdes Maria Ong about something you may know a little bit about. It's Ridley Scott. And she'd like you to comment a little bit on films such as Gladiator and Blade Runner. To what extent do you think filmmakers of, like, you know, Ridley Scott have looked to other forms of visual art for inspiration, such as painting?
Well, we know that Ridley Scott was a visual artist, right, before all of this. And, you know, well, I'm trying to think of the story, like, I believe it was that he was doing a lot of the storyboarding originally, you know, for, if it was Blade Runner or Alien, I forget, you know, where he was able to think visually, right? The relationship that he had to his cinematographers were really kind of different from let's say from somebody like Roger Deakins, excuse me, where you sort of get the sense that Ridley Scott was such a, he wanted to be behind the camera. He was doing most of the design work himself. And a lot of that came from his education as a visual artist. You can really see that in Blade Runner. It's basically a Baroque film. It's like every single shot within that is, for me at least, referencing, Vermeer in some ways, Caravaggio in other ways, late Renaissance like Titian stuff and repoussoirs used all the time, devices on the diagonals, all of those kind of things. So, other directors too, like James Cameron was a visual artist. He was doing matte paintings for things, and then finally decided, well, I want to be on the other end of this and direct films, right? And so directors that have like a really strong visual sensibility, right, I think a lot of the time have that background. There are other ones that don't, that are still very strong visual thinkers that are within that language, but somebody like Ridley Scott, James Cameron, things like that, I think they really used a lot of their arts education behind the visual sensibility of their films, right?
Agree completely, and Blade Runner is just extraordinary.
Should be our drinking game. It's like anytime Blade Runner comes up.
We haven't taken a question from the audience. We have another question in-house here? No, will that? Okay.
You talked about, you were talking, obviously,
So they can follow along.
thanks. You had one piece come up and you were talking about the different mixed media. I guess what I notice in your work, you do a lot of the metamorphosis of the image on the actual piece itself versus maybe like a Van Eyck or like a Hans Holbein, where you feel like the drawing is fully refined, which is sort of what you learn in an academic school as well. Have this totally resolved underpainting, which you then build on. But you're clearly kind of making these developments and discoveries throughout, like creating figures and losing them. So just in my own curiosity, like what mediums or what technical kind of discoveries have you made, like where you can have something forgiving, in something like graphite, which to me, in my own experience, doesn't seem like a medium that you could do that in.
With these, the pieces I'm working on now, it was also like switching from basically graphite into like carbon chalks and charcoal, right, was one of the things. So it's more of a random material, like graphite's amazing for its resolution. It can do like magic tricks with, how you're resolving things and getting a range of value. It's not so great at getting that really bold, like sort of Robert Riggs kind of just the heavy black, the austerity of the blacks, right? So like switching to that was part of it, was just like it changes the way that you're kind of operating. It's like you're drawing with your left hand or something, if you're right-handed, right? In some ways. Then kind of doing a lot of interventions on it, like, okay, having an image, how could I make that almost blur, kind of do this, like the abstract image thing. So using like things like pumice medium and things like that, where you just kind of go over it, and then it like takes you just worked on this drawing for a little while, you put a streak of it, and it degrades the entire image. Then there are artifacts too that I sort of like where it sort of looks like a film, like an old, was it like a VHS film that's where the heads aren't clean on the player. It's probably way before all of your times. But you start getting this like interference streaks, and then suddenly you have a blurred out image. And part of that works better. It's almost like the chance occurrence, right? So that kind of helps. It's a very freeing experience. And then you also have the ability to kind of work back into it. Be like, well, you know what? I wish that arm went back to where it was. And then you can kind of go into developing that a little bit more. And so it's an interesting conversation that you start having with a drawing or a painting, as the case may be, where something comes up into resolution. It changes the image, even though the general design is the same. The composition changes, right? Because the composite of all of those elements this part being refined, whereas this is blurry, or this part being refined and that's blurry, or it changes the value structure, or it changes this. All of those things were very foreign to me. Like I think I'm much more sort of coming from that direction that you were identifying, where it's like, okay, get the drawing done, and then let's go to town on whatever we do, right? And this was like really a departure from that, like really feeling that freedom of being able to destroy an image, to get it back, to destroy it again. Sometimes it gets so destroyed that it's like, okay, well, yeah, can't do that anymore. You see what I mean? If that makes sense. But yeah, so it's kind of a fun and oftentimes very frustrating thing too, you know, but it takes me, I think, away from my natural tendency, which is to try to over-describe, right? In some ways, I think that was the transition from painting too, like into more monochromatic media, was that, wow, however much I describe this, the more mimetic the experience could actually get, the less I had a profound emotional response to the work itself. And it was like, why is that? Is it just because it's getting too close to reality? Is it because it's, and then having that moment when you see a film in black and white, or if I don't know, if you're envisioning a book and the image in your mind is in black and white, how powerful that could be. Looking at a black and white film too, how you're almost taken out of its context, of the context of reality. You have to imagine a space within that. So I think that can kind of give a viewer a place to operate in that. Looking around chaos and things like that, you could see where that would organize itself really well, or I could see where it could organize itself really well into a drawing. Into a colorful, chromatic painting, not so much, just that's not my trip. You know what I mean? So.
All right, Michael, final question comes from Chad Fisher. Thank you very much, Chad. Is there going to be a venue? Where can we see the works of the Decameron series in person, and when, please?
Yeah, I'm working on that, I guess, as we speak. So for a long time, I was really skirting away from the whole experience of actually showing work in totality. Now, as I'm kind of getting to hopefully the conclusion of this body of work here, I'm kind of shopping it around and trying to see like what would be a really good venue, what would the scale of that venue be, and then I'll keep people posted, because I'd really like to get this sort of body of work behind me, but then also try to communicate it and also kind of, respond to the feedback as well, because to see how it's taken, how the work in original is observed, how it's interpreted, what the criticisms of them are, what the praises are, hopefully. You know what I mean? So tell Chad that I'll,
Okay, indeed,
soon as
please keep us
possible,
posted on that. And maybe after this recording is itself posted, which we will do so in the near future on YouTube, on this YouTube channel, you could put in the comment section where we could find the exhibition coming up, because we
Definitely
can't wait
will.
to see him in person.
I'll do that.
So again, I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your immense
you.
wisdom with us. If we could give Michael a round of applause, please, that would be...
Thank you all.
And I want to thank you all virtually for being here. Please join us again for the next Bennett Schmidt lecture on the higher aim of art, with special thanks to Stephen Allen Bennett and Elaine Melody Schmidt, which will be entitled The Spatial Visual Imagination, coming up January 26, 2022, given by the great Patty Watwood. So thank you all again, and happy holidays.